Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Gender equity in the workplace and closing the gender gap has been far slower than it should be, constrained by entrenched biases and structural inequality. Even though there has been great progress made, women continue to face unique pressures, balancing professional, family, and social expectations while carrying the often invisible mental and emotional load. In this episode, we'll explore the research on women's experiences in the workplace, in particular those in leadership roles, and what organizations can do to better support women into senior roles and maintain their well-being. Moving beyond talk to measurable actions that can drive systemic cultural change and ultimately accountability. Our guest today is Dr. Amanda Sterling, an award-winning consultant whose groundbreaking PhD research revealed critical insights into what is still holding women back into leadership roles and the opportunities to address this. Amanda combines her decades of experience working in corporate leadership development, cultural change, and diversity and inclusion in order to help organizations attract and retain more women in leadership and close that gender, pay, and representation gaps. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela.
Amazing. Well, why don't we start off with what first sparked your interest in women and leadership and what ultimately led you to pursue your PhD?
It's a great question. So I need to go back about 8 years to answer this one. And so probably more than 8 years, I was brought up to believe that women could do anything that they wanted to, and I've done that throughout my career. But when I became a mum about 8 years ago now, my son, he's nearly 9, I encountered some barriers when I went back to work after maternity leave. So I was working for a large global manufacturing company in a leadership role, and shortly before I was to return to work after maternity leave, I was told that my job had been simplified. I'd gone to part-time hours. I had asked for the part-time hours, but I hadn't asked for my job to be simplified. And that a more senior role had been created in my team, and they'd given it to the person who was on my maternity leave cover. And at the time, I pushed back on that and said, okay, so why was I not considered for this role? And I was told that I lacked confidence, and I was told I lacked experience. And so I took none of that lying down. And I said, well, give me specific examples of how I'm lacking in those things. And they couldn't give me any examples. And so I did a bit of soul searching around, what is it that I want to achieve with my career and what are the different ways that I can do that while navigating being a mum, leading, because that was really important to me as well, and landed on doing a PhD of all things to try and understand. For me at the time, it was about trying to understand what I thought was my own personal failure, and to try and make sense of that. But the bigger issue that I sought to address, because you can't go to the university and go, I really want to understand my personal failures. You've actually got to have a research question to solve. And so my research question was around, okay, so why do we continue to see an underrepresentation of women in leadership roles, and what can we do about it? And so that was where my journey began about 8 years ago.
And what did you learn in your PhD that helped you come to the conclusion it wasn't a personal failure, but something more systemic?
So the very first year of my research was around women at work. And so trying to understand, okay, what are the barriers that have already been researched? And one of the significant things I found was that motherhood is one of the main barriers that women face on the pathway to leadership because of assumptions and structural challenges that women face when we become mothers. It simply becomes too hard for us to integrate work, let alone leadership, and there's some gender norms that wrap around that as well. And so that was one of the most significant things I found, that and I'm trying to shift my language because I think it'd be easy to go, okay, motherhood's the problem. The problem isn't motherhood. It's the lack of systems that support women going back into work, and assumptions that we have around women and motherhood and dads as well that limit women's careers. They make it, when we become mums, we're more likely to be passed over for promotion, have interest in work dry up, and being kept out of the loop of challenging projects, not necessarily because we're not committed or anything like that, but because it's often because of assumptions that people make around our capabilities and commitment.
Amanda, maybe you could provide some examples of assumptions that are made that you wish you could myth bust.
Yeah, I think it was one of the ones, there's so many assumptions, so many. But one of the ones particularly around this topic is this idea that, so for example, and I talk to a lot of people and they go, okay, I do talk to people who go, actually, we wouldn't hire someone who is pregnant because as soon as that, they're going to go on maternity leave, and then we have to then fill that gap. And so there's an assumption that when women become mums, that our babies are going to be the centre of our worlds. And if anyone listening is a mum, I'm not saying that you have to be, but our babies are the centre of our worlds, but they're not our whole identities. Like, work still has a lot of meaning for us as well. And so it's also it's debunking that, okay, work's not important to us anymore. Like, it still is. We don't operate within a context where we can be traditional housewives. Our economy is not set up for that, nor do we want to be either. So there's that assumption, but there's also the assumption that women are the primary caregivers, and that's more often now not the case. Like, we don't ask, dads of childbearing age, are you going to have children soon? Like, but women, even though we can't, like, employers can't legally ask women those questions, particularly in an interview process. But there's always those assumption lenses that people still apply. But we don't apply those same assumptions to men.
And so, we are obviously wanting to be a bit more solution focused, is what you really wanted people to take away from today's session. So, having identified these common assumptions, what have you learned on how we can tackle those assumptions? Because sometimes they might be unconscious bias as well.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, there's so many different ways to approach this. And I just want to be distinct about, so my work is around women in leadership roles, which is slightly different to women at work. I say just at work, even though we know there's no just about it. And the reason that I make that distinction is because there's a massive amount of research on women at work. Like, we know that motherhood is one of the main challenges that women face on the path to leadership, or the lack of support for women when they become mothers, and then assumptions around women's experiences. But there's actually very little research that looks at the experiences of mothers in leadership roles. And it is quite distinct because there's greater scrutiny, autonomy, and pressure for women in those roles. And I think, the path forward is recognizing that women still have barriers on the pathway to leadership, and we've not solved them. And we actually need to engage a whole lot of people in solving that challenge.
And who, I guess, would you like to call on to solve this problem together?
I think men. Like, we keep, and this is timely because we've just had International Women's Day, and the amount of times, like, I do a lot of talks, and I do a lot of talks that are, particularly International Women's Day is a great example, as women come into the room but we're not actually the ones who are going to solve this. Men are. And you often see like a spattering of men in the groups and they're the allies. But actually, the thing I say to workplaces is we're not actually going to solve this until all of your men are in this room as well. Because women, we're not the ones with the decision-making power. The majority of leaders or people in senior roles who have the power to recruit and retain women, promote, sponsor women into senior roles are still largely men. The data shows us that. And so until we start to engage men in the conversation around, okay, these are the barriers that women experience, this is your role in it, and here are the actions you need to take, then we're actually not going to shift anything. For the last couple of decades, the focus has been on, come on girls, build your confidence, capability and commitment to the workplace, and then we'll see that representation happen. That has not happened, despite lots of investment from workplaces in order to do that, because we're still not the ones who hold the majority of decision-making power and who gets into those roles. And so we need to engage men in that conversation.
I, similar to you, have had the opportunity to speak at these events, and I found two interesting insights. One is for the men who are attending, often they have mentioned that they feel sometimes out of place in these rooms. They felt like, oh, am I allowed to be here? Which is quite an interesting reflection because they do want to be an ally, but when they are significantly in the minority in the room, they feel uncomfortable and they feel like they are intruding in a space that should be a woman-only space. So how do you navigate these assumptions?
I love that as an example because that speaks to a couple of things. And when people tell me that, I go, like, particularly men tell me that, I'm like, okay, so you imagine that feeling that you have being one of few men in that space. Okay, now extrapolate that into the one woman you have on your senior leadership team. So that experience that you're having is what she is having every single day. And then like, oh my gosh, okay. There's an awareness in that, like sit with that discomfort because that's a really important part of your journey and understanding the experiences that women have daily. And then the second thing is like, and I have this cheeky little spreadsheet that cheeky little flow chart I share with event organizers now. And it says, is this event for me? And it asks, are you a woman? Yes, then it is for you. And if you say no, you're not a woman. Do you know any woman? Yes, then this event is for you. And so, I've managed to get a few more people to come along to these events because of that. But until men start actively participating in this, then we're not going to shift things. But the other question I love to ask men in particular is like, do you have daughters? Because if you look at representation right now, that is not just about, okay, there's some distant women over there who are in those roles or lack of women in those roles. That is the decision making that your daughters will have access to. That is the people who are making decisions about their health and welfare, making healthcare based decisions. That is their access to higher paid roles that mean financial freedom to be able to retire comfortably. Like if we don't do something about that, if you don't do something about that, then that impacts on the life that your daughter has. And I think that's another powerful way to open up that conversation as well.
Totally. And so beyond, inviting men to events which raises awareness about these issues, what about on a day-to-day setting of being in the workplace? How would you suggest women can influence decision makers, which are mostly men, into being able to change the status quo?
You can get me to come and talk to them. I'm more than happy to do that. But I think because there's a risk here too, right? That you don't want to be there because we are still coming up against resistance as well, and some of the scary stuff that's happened in the US has made not a lot of people, and I tend to think that there's more good people in New Zealand than maybe the rest of the world or than we think there is. But it has opened up the space of resistance against, maybe we've come too far in this. what I find really helpful is to kind of put people into, like putting people into categories. You get the people who don't know what they don't know and they just don't care. And we can probably think of some world leaders at the moment who are in that category around don't actually care about women's equity or women's rights or anything like that. As much as possible, isolate and ignore that. It sounds like a bit of a health and safety mantra there. Then you get and I think this is the majority of people, don't know what they don't know, but are curious about it, and they just need an opening to have a conversation. And I can't speak directly to men's experiences because I'm not a man, but I can just speak to you what I hear from the men that I talk to is that they feel uncomfortable having this conversation. And so it's opening it up and going, okay, well, where is your discomfort coming from? Tell me about your beliefs and assumptions that are going on for you, because nobody likes it when you go, this is what we should have more women in leadership, and get on your high horse around it, because that can make people defensive. You start from a place of curiosity around, why do you believe that? To use an example, the pushback around, one of the ones I hear around merit and best fit. Like, we hire for merit, based on merit, and we hire the best fit for the role. It's like, well, where is that belief around best fit actually coming from? Like, why do you believe that? What are some of the assumptions that we're making around who is best or what capability looks like? And so it's asking and being really open, like starting from your own place of openness rather than expecting people to get what you're saying. And then the third category is men who already get it and are actively allying. And then it's going, okay, so how can we work together in order to amplify some of this messaging, and how can we support each other in that work?
And let's say we actually have a very committed organization with the right leadership and decision makers around the table wanting to make change. Where have you seen it gone wrong, even when they are well intentioned?
I think there's a couple of things that happen, and I'm just going to talk more broadly about what I see happening out in the workplaces. There's a couple of things that happen. One is, and we've had this for the past couple of decades, there's an overinvestment in leadership development programs that are targeted at women, and that's where a lot of the focus has been for the last couple of decades. But again, that puts the emphasis on, okay, women, like girls, if you build your capability and confidence, we will see this flow through. And that puts a lot of burden on women to step up and speak out. So I think we're going wrong there. The other place I think we go wrong is, I don't really like using the word wrong, but I see them as opportunities to redirect efforts, is we tend to see measurement of representation. And so, for example, there's 31% women on NZX listed companies, and that's just counting how many women are there. But representation doesn't necessarily mean inclusion. And there's this interesting dynamic that came out of my PhD research, where women were looking, so the women in my research were usually in about their late 30s, early 40s with young children, and they were looking at the generations of women that have come before us and going, if that's what it takes, if that's what leadership looks like, then I don't want to do it. One of my research participants, she summed it up with this very visceral quote when she described her female CEO. She said, it's like she's broken the glass ceiling and she expects us to crawl over the broken glass. And it's not, and I say that not to say, oh my God, look at these women, like that's awful. Like, these are also, we have to acknowledge that these are women who have got to where they are by navigating and fighting through a system that wasn't built for them. But that representation doesn't necessarily mean that women's lived experiences are being brought into spaces of decision making and power. And so rather than going, okay, that's where we've gone wrong, I see that as an opportunity to get more holistic around how we're measuring this. So looking at things like engagement and turnover and inclusion, like a broader range of metrics around women's representation.
So what you're saying is that even with putting in solutions, there were assumptions being made, like, for example, providing women-specific leadership programs. So what would you say is a solution that an organization can put in place that's not just will put the onus back on the individual woman, and and instead more of a systemic removal of barriers for women to get into pathways of leadership?
Yeah, and the two most powerful levers that I'm seeing, and there's one that's more progressed than the other one. The first one is more measurement and accountability. And so the workplaces that are doing this work really well, they're not just measuring representation, they're actually also looking at engagement, turnover, who's taking parental leave by gender, and they're using that to frame discussions at senior leadership tables. They are also using that data in their manager performance reviews. And so managers are not just like they're aware of the data, but they're also responsible for the positive changes in that data. And so that's one thing. And the other practice that is shifting the dial and opening up the conversation is inclusive leadership development that is specifically focused on men. Like, it still boggles my mind when we go, okay, there's a women's leadership development program. And it's like, well, okay, so where's the men's leadership development program? Like, this is where this what about men is a really beautiful question to be asking here. Like, why are we just assuming that men are natural leaders? And then what does that tell us about leadership and what's actually rewarded and recognized in leadership if we assume that men are the natural leaders? But there's this real missed opportunity to go, actually, men have still the most power to make these decisions about who is recruited and who is promoted. Do they understand what the barriers are, and do they know what their role is in shifting that?
Mm. And I think it can be very easy to just sort of make the argument of, oh, it just isn't fair, we should have equality. But can you share with us what are the benefits when men are aware of, having a much more diverse and representative leadership group?
Yeah, and so, I mean, the fascinating thing is, because I have these conversations a lot, and there is already a lot of research around the business case for this. Companies that have more diverse leadership teams and more diverse boards financially outperform those that don't. They have better perceptions with their shareholders and better share prices. There's also some interesting data that's come through in recent years. Well, this is more than just recent years, in that women already make 80% of consumer purchasing decisions. And there's a report from McKinsey is that women are one of the fastest growing demographics in terms of generational wealth. And so I love asking leadership teams this question and going, do you understand who your customers are? And does your leadership team actually represent your customers? Because there is no way you can really understand who your customers are if you have no one with lived experience of your customers in your leadership team. The business case and the rationale is already there for it. It's just, helping people become aware of that and start to think about, oh, if we don't change representation, we're missing the boat in a really significant way.
Totally. Well, let's, move forward a little bit and say that actually there are now some women on the leadership team. What are the barriers that's preventing women from staying in the leadership team?
A lot of things. So in my PhD research, one of the things that came out, and this was one of the distinct findings about my research, is that the women in leadership, it is different to women, I say just at work, but I'm using that term really loosely because of there is more scrutiny, more pressure, and more autonomy. And so one of the things I found in my research was that these women were navigating these high pressure leadership roles alongside being mums. And I looked at the experiences of embodied mothers, so pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, and care of young children, because I was interested in what would what would women experience when we could not avoid or hide what was going on for us? And so they were navigating high pressure leadership as well as kind of the high pressure early years of motherhood. And what I found was that there was also an additional level of labor that these women were engaging in. I called it emotional, mental, and physical labor as they tried to navigate the tensions and disconnects and contradictions between those two worlds. And so this is that is it's an identity challenge, and it's a burnout challenge as well. It's like that, not just the mental shift, the physical shift, the emotional labor of all of those things. And it's an additional burden that these women were having to navigate.
And, hopefully there are men listening to this episode who might not necessarily understand this. Can you share some example of what are these additional loads that women carry that men might traditionally not?
Yeah. And so one of the ones that I think is quite pertinent is we often say that women lack confidence. But there was this really interesting dynamic that emerged in my research. So when I asked these women, okay, what does leadership mean to you? They described it as either a white male or a childless female. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but when you're a woman who is going through an experience that means that you physically cannot perform like a white male or childless female, because it is literally written on your body that you're not, like there's scrutiny attached to that as well. A lot of these women described, the emotional burden of having to deal with additional scrutiny. It becomes, that's an additional labor for them to carry. But one of the interesting things I found was that, because we often tell women that they lack confidence, like in women we do experience this lack of confidence, but what I found was that these women were going to additional lengths to prove that they are just as capable, confident and committed as their white male or childless woman. So they were doing this, like it was additional work. So they were meeting all of the performance expectations and our expectations of their roles, all their objective measures of performance. But because they didn't see how their experience as a woman was valued and recognized within their workplace, they were going to additional lengths to prove that they were just as worthy. Like these women described a lack of so they described a lack of this additional effort to prove that they were just as capable, confident, and committed. And so it was this really interesting dynamic around, well, you're already doing all of the things, but you have to do this extra layer to prove that you're already doing these things and you're worthy of being there, because we often feel like we're not, but it's actually got nothing to do with us.
Do you think that these organizations are acknowledging these extra work that the women are doing, or do you think that they're just not even aware?
I think part of the efforts to do, so for example, women in leadership development programs and employee resource groups that are, women's networks across organizations, I think those are a step towards doing that, for providing safe space for women to talk about and normalize some of these challenges. But I think systemically, no, I don't think that gets taken into account, because if you were taking that into account, you would be trying to actively shift some of those norms that are creating those expectations for women. And this isn't about, and when I say that this isn't about going, oh, women have things going on, we should support and make space for that, and we need extra help, or we're not as capable. My point is that we are already doing we are meeting all of the objective standards of performance and going to additional efforts. And there is more conscious and explicit work that needs to be done to go, actually, you don't need to go to this. You don't need to prove yourself. You are already valuable and worthy, and we value your skills.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for sharing that. And look, ultimately, we have a a framework that you've developed called the 4 factors that could be something that organizations can look at as a way of systematically actually assessing whether they have what is needed to be put in place. Do you want to share with us a little bit about the 4 factors framework?
Yeah, so the 4 factors is something I developed last year because after doing a PhD on this and then working in this space, I noticed how there was a lot of research that talks about the barriers and the challenges that women face. And like you read articles from like McKinsey and Forbes and the World Economic Forum, and it's all about, the broken rung remains unfixed and women are exiting the workforce in the greatest, numbers and years, particularly post-COVID. And I was going, okay, cool. So we know more about the problems and we know even more about the problems, but what are the solutions? What are the things that are having the most positive impact on women's careers? And where can workplaces focus their attention to better support women? So I designed this survey to capture it. And I ran the survey last year and I got 212 responses. And then I ran it again. It just closed a few weeks ago. I ran it again and got 410 responses. And one of the questions I asked is, I listed all of the things that the research says are the things that support women's careers, like all of them: sponsorship, mentorship, leadership development, role models, you name it. And then I asked women, what are the top 3 things that have had the most positive impact on your career? Like, what has actually helped you? And then in my analysis, I distilled, I drew out all of those responses and I distilled them into the top 4. So I call them the 4 factors. And so that's then, okay, these are the things that we know are working for women. And it gives a framework for workplaces to go, okay, if we focus on these 4 things, we can better support women into leadership roles. So flexible work. So these are work arrangements that enable women to navigate caregiving alongside their leadership roles. And hugely important because we are still the primary caregivers. And so enabling us to do that. Mm. So partner support is number 3 on the list. Last year it was number 2 on the list. And that is someone who, particularly if you have kids, but even if you don't have kids, but if you have kids, it's someone who takes on at least 50% of the caregiving responsibility or is the primary caregiver. I did this workshop last week and I asked them, it was mostly men, and I asked them who in the room is the primary caregiver, and a couple of them put up their hand. And then I asked them, okay, so who in the room takes on at least 50% of caregiving and domestic labour at home? And I had a few more put up their hand. And then I went, and so would your partner say you take on 50%, or would it be less than that? And then some of them sheepishly put their hands down. But it opens up an entirely different conversation. Manager support was one of the top factors positively impacting women's careers. So this is a manager who has career conversations with you and actively advocates and supports you into a leadership role.
Mm-hmm. So we've got 3 of the 4 so far, is that right?
So you've got 3 of the 4. So there's one more, and it's actually one of the obvious ones. Women's leadership development programs is the 4th factor. And that is acknowledging that while women don't need fixing, the system does, but we still need support within that system. And so it's those safe spaces for women to discuss challenges, work around those issues, and also build capability and confidence into leadership roles. But then I do go, well, okay, so where's the men's leadership development program? And when we start to think about things like, okay, so if supportive managers and partner support are 2 of the top factors, who are the majority who are still in management roles, and who are the majority who are partners to women? So if we're not actually actively engaging men in these conversations around women's careers and leadership opportunities, then we're missing the people that have the most power to create change.
And just maybe if I could just be a devil's advocate a little bit, I don't know whether I would say it's a workplace responsibility around whether you have a supportive partner or not, or do you disagree?
Well, so I mean, I agree with you on that, and it's not a workplace responsibility to go to, like, workplaces aren't going to go, right, well, do you really think you should marry that person? Like, do they tick all of these boxes? Or maybe that might be, I might have appreciated that when I got married. As a disclaimer, I'm divorced now, so that might have been useful. But the thing that workplaces can focus on is shifting gender norms around parenting. And so we know that when men take parental leave, they are more likely to be active caregivers after parental leave. And so one of the things that workplaces can do is create gender equal parental leave policies, have the men in their leadership roles actually role modeling, taking on those policies and role modeling being active caregivers as well. And so there is something that workplaces can do to normalize men taking a more active role in caregiving and domestic labor to shift that gender norm. And it might not be something that directly impacts their organisation, but it will directly impact the organisation that that person's partner works for, and then hopefully vice versa if more workplaces start doing that as well.
That's actually a really great framing. So yeah, the workplace can't necessarily tell you which partner would be supportive, but the policies like making sure that they take parental leave is an example to flip that switch, basically.
Yeah, and normalising men taking sick leave and that sort of thing as well.
Exactly. And also in Scandinavian countries like Sweden, that they really have entrenched parental leave for both the partner and the mother as well. So that's definitely something that we have seen very clear results internationally that it does work. Second devil's advocate question, you talked about women's leadership development program being a safe space for women, to explore their leadership growth and the areas where they might not be as confident on, etc. In those spaces, should men be in those spaces? Because I guess, I'm trying to understand, when should it be a woman's only space versus when should men be in the space as well?
For those kinds of leadership development programs, I think they need to stay as a woman's only space, women or people who identify as women, because it needs to be a safe space where women can talk openly and transparently about their experiences. I think we still need those safe spaces. I think these are different conversations. There is a conversation, a leadership conversation for women in those safe spaces, just for women. There is a conversation for women and men in leadership teams to share experiences in a safe and supported way. And then there is inclusive leadership capability development that needs to happen for men. But they have different purposes and they are different spaces, and there are different things that we need to do to ensure that each group feels safe and supported in the ways that they need to be.
Almost seems like there needs to be a very clear disclaimer at the top. What is the purpose? So that, we don't have men then saying in certain spaces where they are invited that, oh, I'm encroaching in a woman's safe space, because actually the purpose is not for what that is outlined.
And it's just making it really clear that that's what it is. Like, another example, there are 2 talks that I deliver as part of the work that I do. And one is for women around women's experiences. And one is around, okay, we need to get everyone together to solve this problem of gender equity. And that is for men and women. It's just being very clear that there are different focuses and then there are different spaces that need to be created there.
Well, you gave a really great example about what workplaces can do for one of the factors, which is supportive partners. What about supportive managers? What can workplaces do to create more supportive managers that advocate for women?
Yeah, and I think that there are a couple of things that you can do, and you can do this in a multi-pronged way. And I think one of them is helping those managers become more aware of the challenges that women experience that are different to men's. exploring my research is a way to do that. But I know workplaces who do this really well, and they get speakers to come in and talk about menopause, and and women's experiences, and they actively engage all their leaders in trying to understand what the experiences are that women have. I've had people tell me, having a coffee with someone the other week, and she said her partner had come home and said that I've got a team member who reports to me that I'm pretty sure is going through menopause. I need to have a conversation with her about it, but I don't know anything about menopause. Can you help me? Can you help me frame up how I approach this conversation? And so it's equipping leaders to actually have some potentially awkward conversations around the experiences that women have. So I call them the 3 M's: menstruation, maternity, and menopause. They need greater awareness of those challenges in order to do that, and they need some basic conversation skills in order to have that in a safe, non-awkward way. So it's raising awareness and equipping them with some of those critical conversation skills. And also, I've come from a background where I've done a lot of training and development with managers, and we still have a lot of people who are recruited or promoted into management and leadership roles because they are subject matter experts, but not necessarily good people leaders. So even things as basic as teaching managers how to have a coaching conversation around someone's career, to actively listen, to ask good questions. What does a good question look like? How do you create a safe space to have a conversation? Like, these are basic skills that a lot of leaders still struggle with. So some of this isn't about gender equity at all. It's just equipping managers with basic sounds pejorative, but just like simple management skills. Like, can you have a conversation with your person that might be potentially uncomfortable? And just give people tools to be able to do that.
Totally. And that's kind of what we learned as well, is that it's not that managers don't want to do these things that we've talked about, is that they feel not equipped, not knowledgeable about how to have these conversations. And that's why, at Clearhead, we're an EAP provider. We make sure that people who are struggling can get professional help, but there's so much proactive content on our library, which is about how to have the difficult conversation as a manager, because that's the thing that prevents the distress from happening to start with.
And 9 times out of 10, it's beautiful that you provide those resources as well, because once you have a toolkit, you can kind of you just rely on your toolkit. And even if you've got a script and you're leaning on that, it's massively helpful for people who have not done that before. We can't assume that people can just go in and have awkward conversations. Most of us don't want to. And it's just, hugely helpful to have a tool that we can lean on.
Totally. Across those 4 factors, do they differ depending on the career stage or the seniority or the life circumstances of women, or do you find them kind of consistent?
Yeah, so in my analysis, I haven't split it down too much, because I'm kind of looking at some broader themes. But one of the things I have done in the upcoming report, so I'm releasing a report in a couple of weeks' time that goes into a deeper analysis of these 4 factors. For women who are so one of the things I've looked at is the difference between women who are in leadership roles, so CEO, executive, C-suite roles versus board positions. So for board roles, partner support drops off and sponsorship becomes one of the top 4 factors. And that makes sense when you look at the demographic there. And so the majority of women who are in those board roles who have completed the survey are usually 55 years and older. So past having children and then needing that support, but needing that active advocacy and putting their names forward for roles, which is where sponsorship becomes more important. I just wanted to clarify, my comment was the partner support drops off because you have less responsibilities for young children in particular, but absolutely, and a lot of women are facing that sandwich generation of young children and parents. So this complexities around caregiving don't end when women are no longer mothers, because then we have the other end of it as well.
How would you manage the balance between sort of advocating for action because it is a matter of justice versus having to justify the action because, as you said, there's a business case that it makes a company more profitable?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to weigh up both. I ask the question around, what world do you want to create for your daughters to appeal to people's hearts around this? And then I talk to the business case, particularly around your customers are majority women are the ones making purchasing decisions, and do you actually understand your customers? But I also put it in the context of actually in the world that we're living in right now, where there's greater uncertainty, economic pressures, and AI, our jobs are changing really fast. We need people from different lived experiences to come together and solve complex problems. So not only are you representing your customers and your communities you serve and setting the world up that your daughters can survive and thrive in, you actually need this as a critical business competency. And it's not just about representation, it's about bringing all sorts of people with different lived experiences together to solve complex problems. That tends to land like as a multi-pronged approach, because you're framing it as this is a critical business issue, not just because there's a business case, but you need these skills in your workplace in order to survive and thrive.
In terms of, have you actually seen examples of what it looks like when an organization has gotten all four factors right? Have you seen that? And if so, could you share an example of it?
Yeah, so the one that has got most of them right was a case study that I did a couple of years ago now, and that was with Z Energy. And so they've been doing a number of things. So on the supportive manager front, this is a workplace that measures and holds their managers accountable for gender equity. And so they have a broad suite of metrics that they look at beyond representation. So things like engagement, turnover, who's taking parental leave. So they look at all of that, and then it's embedded into managers' performance reviews as well. Flexible work is normalised across the workplace, and they've got pretty clear guidelines around working in the office or not. And they've set that up really well, and it's role modelled by their senior leadership teams. And they've also got pretty progressive partner support practices as well. In fact, when I did the case study with them, that was the thing that originally tweaked me to the importance of partner support in this, because the majority of the women that participated in the focus groups I did with them were like, I wouldn't be able to do what I do without my partner doing what he does and being the primary caregiver or taking on half the load. What was quite distinct about them though is that a lot of what they were doing, so their four factors were playing out quite strongly, but it sat under this umbrella where they were committed to having their leadership team represent the customers and communities that they served, and so that then flowed through to all of the mechanisms that they were using.
Well, another shout out for Z Energy. They are a client of us, and they look at EAP beyond just a reactive, here's some support available if you're struggling, to actually doing a lot of the proactive, preventative work that I was mentioning before around assessing and measuring psychosocial risk hazards that are affecting people's mental health because of workplace factors like workload, like maybe reward and recognition. And so that's something that's really cool. Ultimately, it is part of the DNA of an organization to be able to do this properly, which is about being really clear about your intention, your values, and then actually measuring to demonstrate that you are doing what you say you want to do. So, yeah.
And then it becomes something much broader than women in leadership. It becomes you're creating a workplace culture where everybody is supported and thrives.
Exactly. Totally agree. Well, then, let's sort of shift in terms of the way that we think about measures to the broader well-being, broader long-term sustainability of, women in leadership. What have you seen, works in terms of measuring well-being in the organization, if you do that at all?
Oh, I don't. So that's not part of the work I do specifically, but in the workplaces. So New Zealand Energy is a good example of this, that are doing this work really well, then they do tend to have higher engagement, lower turnover scores.
And ultimately, that's kind of what you're saying is measuring the benefits for teams and culture and organizational performance more broadly. Is that right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we're close towards the end. If there's one thing that any person listening or any organization who wants to take just one action that's informed by your research, what would you encourage them to focus on?
I would I think the main thing would be to start a conversation. And so whether, if you're listening in today, start a conversation with one man or one woman in your life, depending on whether you're a man or a woman attending this conversation, about this topic, and ask them what they think. Share what you've learnt and ask them what their beliefs are around this, because I think the more conversations that we have, the better. And the more we have this conversation around, these are the challenges that women still experience, and here are the ways that we can start to mitigate that, then we can start to shift things.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for sharing, Amanda. We close these sessions off with one question, which is, what is your one wellbeing practice that you do to stay well?
Good question. I do a little meditation each day, and I just put my legs up. As a practice I learnt in yoga, and I put my bum on a bolster and I put my legs up the wall because I get really tight hips, and it just helps release my hips and rest my heart, and I listen to some music. And I do that for at least 10 minutes every evening. It just helps me center and kind of decompress from the day.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.